All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I will now turn it over to Nathan Brinklow, Associate Head of Indigenous Studies, to start us off in a good way. Nathan?
Just one moment here. Just give me a second. I got to get my text sorted out. Apologies for this. Obviously, we didn't have this problem in the setup, so just give me one more moment and I'll make sure this goes. Okay, what's going on? My name is Nathan Brinklow. I'm going to be speaking a combination of Mohawk and English today, and so invite you to follow along. Nathan Brinklow. Nene radina tung konde jorhonzam. Ganyo ke ha gani wakwan zoda, danankade gani duwageno. Wagenya ton ni. I'm very glad to greet you today. My name is Nathan Brinklow in English. I'm from the Turtle Clan and come from the Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. I am, in fact, Mohawk. I teach our language and culture here at Queen's, and I'm Assistant Department Head in Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, where I help with the Indigenous Studies program. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Victoria, where I'm studying how we can raise our Indigenous languages back up again and make them strong. Gane agogoratne keri hunyanis nuangowana danungori hodas danarishnenos reat de guetnio nera ditokwa ne owana kahidun sra sua danani hotini hoderi hodas. Ne asogoyot don sragonze ne unga huene hayun de wayan stakwa. Wagadewayan stu hadze oni ne yunderi wan stakwa go ne Victoria zi ni zi IT de wada de wana garada de dana IT de wada de wana satstet ne yungwa hungwe ungwana sua. Agoi konsi ugatsanuni zini ungwa hwanza gwe kon yungwa zat dororo uan hiserade na aidwa tahunsa dade dana aidwa tarunya zini zikigori huwana. I'm so happy that we've been able to gather ourselves here today and to gather to discuss these important things as we think and listen and chat. So in our ways, when we gather to meet, the first business is to send greetings, to thanks, respect, and acknowledgements to all of the natural world, to all those things that swim, the plants that grow, the animals that grow, the birds that fly, and the things that go about in the sky. Ii nungwadi ne ganyak haga nungwari hoda ne nona ayungwat kaniza ne ejori wachero ne daits nu hordado ne agwe on de warne gonsu zohanzake. Ne gi ne yung kiawe nungwa sotogun ne gaha ungwa sotogun agaha ne skana agahage skana I don't want to do usege dan on scott nigurna of the wadum. This is the way that was given to us by our grandparents who have now gone on, so that peace would continue in our thoughts and we can come to one mind. As I speak today, I encourage you to think upon the things that you depend on to live good lives and the things that support you on a good way. So then let us begin. Uoni serade a gweg on Oscar di under the walk wet noon in the guahni gurna, that on dates no quadado a gweg on wet sua, Gini jungon on wes a wat getote, down on Zini hadis yatahunes. Today, we send our greetings to all of the people, to those of you who are able to join us today, and for those of you, and to those who can't be here either. We send our greetings that we continue to work together in peace, that we can make peace, and we also today send our greetings to those who are fighting to bring peace back up from the ground. Negari dates no hordadon chi sego awadon skatne yungo daje, danon skona aizuni, zinidzi, danon zini hadi renderios ne yuwanzo gayune, ne skona, amza hunda deri wakarla dade, togani odohakne nungwani gurna. We send our greetings to our mother, the earth, as she continues to go along, giving up of her own strength for us to live good lives. And we turn our thoughts to the water, and we send our greetings to the waters here and there as they still flow and clean the earth as they go. Negadi nua, de yung guad negadi huntos neo nega nungadi, dan dates no corado, negat negarunya gisegon, gat negadache, dan on de wado darhos, zino ahead, contrano wanzage. Dano ne nu dates no corado, aguego, o wange tadidra, ne sego rodio daje, duknot na sagum han, nesangwe. As one, we gather our minds and we send our greetings to everything that grows on the earth. The roots, the small things that grow in the ground, the grasses, the flowers, the fruits and the berries that lead them, the medicines that still heal us when they're sick. And we also send our greetings to our life sustainers. Those are the food plants. Dano dates nu cordato ne garunda sua ne wata ni gagoroda ne honda ikade giscona yung nega or sisegon yung nega wis ne jonun quatsara jora do songong guidet saratso toganyo do hakne and guatni gorna. And we send our greetings to the animals that grow on the earth, the bugs that still go about cleaning up the world and spreading the pollen from flower to flower, the wild animals that we see here and there running about. And we send our greetings to all of the birds that still carry their beautiful songs, those that can lift up our minds when they're low to the ground. And we turn our minds to the sky. We gather them together and send our greetings to all the things that go about in that place. Ne gadi dates no cordato no hoton de warne etonu. Ne dates no cordato ne gaieri ni cawarage, gisego lo dio dage ne yunkisoto gua, radiweras, hadiweras este, dano hadigonorete, sending our greetings to the winds and the thunders that they still work together, freshening the air and bringing the rains. Sending our greetings to the moon and the sun, those that shine light during the day and during the night. And we send our greetings to the stars that we see across the sky. And one more time, we bring our minds together. We send our greetings to the great natural powers of the world. Some people recognize this as the creator, others know different kinds of names for that which holds all of the natural things of the world together in one. So we send our greetings and we let this continue in our minds. I've done my best, I've done how I know how, and I invite you to fix up for yourselves anything that I may have forgotten by calling that to your minds. I send my thanks to those who invited me to be here today to raise up these few words, to share these few words. And I send my greetings to all of you who have gathered here, that peace would continue in our thoughts during our time together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan, for beginning our time together with the Ohonrun Garewa Digwan. Your words cause me to reflect on all the elements that sustain us and allow us to gather here today. In my capacity as Associate Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's University, and on behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you to this special event. We join you from Kingston, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories and unceded territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. It is my understanding that this territory is included in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which holds us all into account in coming together in peace, friendship, and respect. Today, we welcome Dr. Eve Tuck, as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Center for Teaching and Learning. Core to our vision has always been a spirit of collaboration, where we have aimed to work with faculty, adjunct instructors, postdoctoral fellows, undergraduate and graduate students, and communities on the improvement of teaching for the express purpose of improving students' learning. For many of us at the center, this anniversary has caused us to look back on our center's history as well as look forward. And in doing so, we welcome Dr. Tuck in our efforts to imagine new possibilities for what that vision of collaboration looks like and with whom. I'd also like to welcome all of you who join us today from around the world. You find yourself amongst a global community with representation from over 35 Canadian higher education institutions and over 25 international participants from across Turtle Island, South America, and Europe. We hope today's talk will inspire your participation through conversation and reflection on our collective responsibilities to build diverse, equitable, inclusive, and anti-racist communities, and to indigenize and decolonize higher education. Dr. Yasmin Jerbal, who's an educational developer in the center, will now take a moment to thank our sponsors of the event and, of course, introduce our guest of honor, Dr. Tuck herself.
Thank you, Lauren. And before I introduce Dr. Eve Tuck, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and give thanks to the folks who have helped us put together this event today, in front and behind the scenes. The two wonderful interpreters, Rana and Jose, thank you for being here. To Caitlin and Zach for all their technical support. And to Sandra for helping us coordinate this event, all the while juggling multiple situations this week. Thank you so much. And thank you also to the rest of the CTL team for supporting us. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, the Sutherland Visitorship Fund, the Inclusive Community Fund, the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, and the Faculty of Educations and for directions for their support. It is my greatest honor to introduce Professor Eve Tuck, Associate Professor of Critical Race and Indigenous Studies, Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. She is Canada Research Chair of Indigenous Methodologies and Youth and Communities, and also founding director of the Toronto Circle Lab. Award-winning Unanga scholar, Professor Tuck is internationally regarded for her contributions to educational research and Indigenous studies. She has worked closely with diverse urban and rural communities to conduct research that improves education and social policy, particularly for disadvantaged and marginalized youth. Eve Tuck is co-editor with Kei Wayne Yang of a book series with Routledge titled Indigenous and Decolonizing Studies in Education, which presently has 5 titles with 2 forthcoming, and has published extensively in journals such as the Harvard Education Review, American Quarterly, Educational Policy, Qualitative Inquiry, and International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. For those podcast lovers such as myself, she also makes a podcast with graduate students at OISE called The Hands Forward on relationships between Indigenous and Black communities on Turtle Island. Thank you, Professor Eve Tuck, for being here with us today. It is truly an honor.
Greetings. Ang Eve Tuck esta cooking. Atlantic City esta the cooking. I am offering my lecture today from Atlantic City, New Jersey, where I'm visiting family. As we passed back into Lenape-Hoking, we greeted the lands and the waters in the ways that I have been taught to do. And I hope that my words to you are in good relation to Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and also in good relation to Lenape people here and in diaspora. Thank you for these kind introductions. And I very much appreciate those who have coordinated my virtual interactions with scholars at Queen's and who nominated me for the Robert Sutherland Visitorship Award. Today, I am choosing to open my lecture with a very important document of the Toronto Circle Lab. And that is the Sloth Scale. So where are you today as we begin this lecture on this really diverse scale of sloths? To ease into the room and into this presentation, I ask you to take a moment to reflect. And if we were in another format, I would invite you to use the chat. But instead, you might text a friend about where you are today on the sloth scale. In my lecture today, I will discuss what I see as the community histories and broader imperatives of social science that have prompted me and many others to focus on meaning making in research. I will then tell the story of a recent youth participatory action research project called Making Sense of Movements. Several years ago, I was invited by the Spencer Foundation to offer a related lecture at the University of Illinois, Chicago, titled, "Is This Thing On? Researching with Youth and Communities." This lecture is available on YouTube, and you can see what I look like with bangs. I mentioned this lecture because I think of it as a precursor to this one, which is titled Meaning Making with Youth and Communities. It goes in, that lecture goes into more detail about the role of research in expanding settler colonialism and an analysis of the accumulative and exploitative imperatives of typical social science, and my long-standing critique of damage-centered research. A primary drive in my research has been to understand the purposes of research from the perspectives of Indigenous communities and the ethics of non-exploitation and non-extraction that are core to these practices. I study this in part because of the stories of harm and exploitation done by researchers to earlier generations in my community on St. Paul Island in Alaska. Stories of research abuse and misconduct were told to me at my grandmother's kitchen table. I have spent the last nearly 15 years teaching and publishing about the reasons that I engage in participatory collaborative research with youth and community organizations. One of my first publications was a chapter with 6 youth researchers in the collective of researchers on educational disappointment and desire. a youth research collective that I formed in order to study school pushout and the GED, and what would become my dissertation. Many of the themes of that chapter continue to be central to my practice as a researcher today. These include who knows most about institutions and systems of social exclusion, creativity and inventiveness in methods and design, engaging theory and felt sense, making research that meets community needs, sharing responsibilities, deciding together how we decide, and framing our work in relation to desire and resistance rather than damage and trauma. The themes we wrote about in 2008 continue to be central themes in our research practice in the Toronto Circle Lab at the University of Toronto. I wanted to be sure in my paper today to not just go back to what I have written in the past and rehearse that again for you. Instead, I wanted to take this as an opportunity to think about what I would like to say from across these years of theorization and practice, and on this occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's University. People who don't do youth participatory action research or collaborative research with young people might think of it as methods that are modified to be kid-friendly, like Greek yogurt with Fruit Loops sprinkled on top. In 2008, my youth co-researchers wrote that our approach to participatory action research holds that those upon whose backs research has historically been carried out are instead researched alongside. CRED's approach to PAR is concerned with what knowing is and where knowing comes from, believing that it is often those at the bottom of social hierarchies who know the most about social oppression, but also the radical possibilities towards redressing domination. For us, PAR means that there is transparency on all matters of the research. The research questions are co-constructed. The project design and design of the research methods are collaboratively negotiated and co-constructed. Analysis is co-constructed. And then the products of the research are dynamic, interactive, and are prepared and shared in collaboration. A number of scholars who engage in participatory research with youth and children have attempted to describe participation not as an absolute, but as a spectrum. Roger Hart has created among the most well-known and cited metaphors, the ladder of young people's participation. My mentor, Michelle Fine, along with her frequent collaborator, Maria Elena Torre, has at different times described degrees of participation, not as a ladder, but as a volume radio dial. In some studies, the participation is there at full volume or full strength, but in other studies, the volume is lower. For many, there is an important distinction between scholars who do qualitative and quantitative work. I do not find this to be the most telling distinction. Across a number of publications and lectures, I have posited that a compelling, startling question to ask ourselves in our work is, do you do research on people or with people? Research has not been neutral in systems of settler colonialism and anti-Blackness. Research across many fields, indeed the founding of many fields, has been in the business of justifying enslavement, genocide, dispossession, segregation, and expropriation. It has done this in real time in order to support policies informed by eugenics, and after the fact to explain away the harms of settler colonialism and transatlantic slavery that we continue to live with every day. This is why I find the difference between doing research on and doing research with to be a compelling ethical and epistemological difference. It may seem to be a steep divide between doing research on people and with people. If it seems stark to say either on or with, I want to reassure you that there are actually many, many ways to do work with young people, and communities. There are many ways to shift from doing research on to doing research with. Research on or with has to do with the questions that we ask. To do research with someone is to ask them questions about their life or experiences, and their answers become our data, and we analyze, or excuse me, to do research on someone is to ask them questions about their life or experiences, and their answers become our data that we analyze, theorize, and turn into findings. It is to say to someone, you are the bag of oranges that I am investigating. To do research with someone is to not make them the bag of oranges, but instead to be shoulder to shoulder with them and make the institutions that they inhabit, or the policies that affect them, or the social movements that affect them into the bag of oranges. Then together we are investigating how these institutions and policies and movements work and their relationships to them. Their relationships to these institutions and policies and movements become the bag of oranges that we are investigating together, and their experiences and theorizing become important for the questions that we ask, the data that we collect, and the interpretations and findings that we develop. More, it is important that this looking and thinking is done in a collective in order to understand both shared and specific experiences in relation to the bag of oranges. Researching with means working against extraction fantasies. Within social science, generally, there is a preoccupation with learning what people really think. There is a fantasy of somehow being able to tap into a person's pure, unadulterated thoughts, pristine and untampered with by outsiders. Knowledge about a topic is on the inside of the person being interviewed, and the job of the interviewer is to get it out and record it. The recorded knowledge is turned into data to be analyzed alongside other data that were also once on the inside of someone before being pried out. Not only is the interviewer supposed to get the knowledge out, but they're supposed to get it out in a way that is pristine. From this understanding, pure, untampered with knowledge or experience is just contained in the person being interviewed. They may or may not know that it has value. The interviewer surely knows it has value, so they have to try to get it out. But it only counts if it is the same on the outside as it would have been on the inside. So it isn't hard to detect the colonial research or resource extraction overlay of this understanding of knowledge. Mining motifs are easy to apply here. Knowledge is tapped, accessed, drawn out, revealed. Effective interviews drill down, dig into, probe what a participant knows. The interview participants holds knowledge as a raw material and cannot or does not know its value. Perhaps it does not have value until the interviewer is also able to process that raw material into something of use. The presumption that a person does not know their thoughts have value, or that their experiences need to be processed in order for them to have social value is a colonial presumption. Guides for qualitative interviewers are often encourage interviewers to pretend not to know about something, embodying a deliberate naivete, so that interview participants will maybe be more open to talking to them about interview topics or be more expansive in their answering. Such toolkits offer advice to get a person talking and to build rapport. Much emphasis is on building trust. This is not necessarily so that the interviewer can become a more trustworthy person in relation to the person being interviewed, but rather to try to get them to respond in an unguarded way. The goal of behaving in a way so that the person being interviewed lets their guard down is entangled with the preoccupation with knowledge as a pristine resource to be tapped. Some of the most pointed advice offered by research how-to books and also university faculty is away from asking leading questions. Leading questions are those questions that are imbibed with expectation, so much so that it is difficult for the interviewee to answer without discomfort. This is a leading question is often a critique that faculty advisors will use to admonish novice researchers as they create research designs and interview guides. Asking leading questions is so high up on the to avoid list that many advisors and novice researchers alike overcorrect for it. Interviewers are often encouraged away from asking questions too closely connected to their actual research questions. Instead, they create meandering lists of questions, asking participants to tell their whole life stories. They ask questions at a broad scale, hoping that later, when working with the recorded material and transcripts, they will be able to extrapolate from these musings in order to reflect on their actually very specific questions. In some scenarios, trying to overcorrect away from leading questions can, in effect, mean trying to deceive a person by not disclosing what an interview is about in order to get them to reveal something that they do not know is important to the interviewer. This can mean disguising the true focus of a set of questions or asking things in a way that diminishes the significance of an area of inquiry. The influence of Freudian psychotherapy techniques has done us dirty in qualitative research. Interview techniques that cast a wide net by asking questions generally or tangentially connected to research questions leave all of the interpretation and meaning making to the interviewer, to the researcher. This can also be true for lines of questioning that ask for life stories or earliest memories of a particular social phenomenon. I'm not saying that there are no circumstances in which an indirect approach to interview questions might be most effective. There are interviews that we might do with powerful people or people who hold power over us, who would be disinclined to be forthcoming. In the case of powerful people, we might have to ask indirect questions and then surmise from their answers what reality they are both trying to convey and conceal. Or we might talk to a person who has very little power but is an agent or is employed by a powerful institution. In this case, they as a person might want to tell us more than they are permitted by their role. Researching with means troubling the definition of effective questions. More, I want to pause and interrogate the question of whether the goal of an interview is to be as effective as possible, at least in the traditional sense of that word, effective. If we take seriously the view that I have argued for here, that knowledge in an interview is not knowledge that resides inside the participant to be cracked open and accessed by the interviewer, then the goal of our questions shift. The definition of an effective question shifts too. A troubling definition of an effective question would be one that gets a participant to say something that they don't want to say, or we're planning deliberately to not say. That would be almost a way of trying to get around the conditions of consent established at the start of an interview. Another troubling definition of an effective question would be one that tries to get a participant to contradict themselves or tell a lie or otherwise embarrass themselves. Our questions are not more effective if we somehow catch people. Our questions are not cops. Again, and I'm thinking about that we are interviewing the student or the teacher and not the superintendent, the worker and not the CEO. So to take the inverse, an effective question might be one that invites a participant to share what they want to say, what they, in their saying yes to the interview or any thought that they've given to the importance of this interview in their life, hoped that they would have the chance to say. An effective question invites a participant to think aloud in real time, to bring together little threads or inklings of thoughts and impressions, perhaps for the first time, in order to consider what is being asked. This is totally different in intention and practice than a gotcha question that is attempting to get someone to say something against themselves and their communities and their experiences. If we are trying to avoid questions that make it likely that participants will betray themselves, we might take the inverse to mean that we are asking questions that allow them to be generous with themselves and their communities. Further, our questions can invite people to reflect on something in a new way or return to a prior way of understanding something. Researching with means creating opportunities for co-theorizing. My personal practice is to ask questions that create opportunities for the participant to analyze society, institutions, policies, social movements, and other phenomena. These questions are specifically intended to invite participants to theorize the world and to co-theorize it with me or us as the research team. Thus, I don't want to just hear the story or the account or the experience. I ask also for their interpretation. The why do you think that this happened and what do you think that this means? In doing this, I am refusing to be the only one playing the role of theorist. I believe the interview should be focused not only on collecting the stories of participants, but on engaging participants in how they interpret what happens to them inside and outside of institutions, in relations to policies and the state, and the work of social movements. The role of a researcher who researches with people, for me, is to take on the responsibility of facilitating others' meaningful participation in systematic knowledge generation and analysis. Because research is staged, there are many points for entry and exit within any particular study. In saying that research is staged, I am not saying that it is linear. Actually, in referring to it as stage or embracing its stagedness, I'm leaning into its non-linearity. We often artificially bracket off particular time stages in a study in order to signal to ourselves and to others what is going on. I am in the relation building stage, the design stage, the recruitment or data collection stage. These actually, as we all know, are not defined or discrete. They are not over once they are over. They are not done once we are not in them. They can actually get better and more apparent once we leave these stages, or they can get undone and less apparent. The only thing true that we can say about these stages is that we are making them up, because they somehow help us to make sense of a story that matters to us, or that we hope will matter to us at some point in the future. In embracing research as a process that is staged, not because it is linear, but because we need to have a sense of movement or storytelling to our work, we can also think of all of these stages as opportunities to embody the epistemology of researching with rather than on. To engage in meaning making with is to believe that young people and community members are experts in their own lives. It is a belief that young people are always interpreting and theorizing their social worlds and the institutions they inhabit and to which they are in relation. We can make our research as a set of stages in which we can meaningfully invite collaborators to be with us as co-designers, co-researchers, and co-theorists. When working with young people, because youth is a time-sensitive social category and one that to me becomes significant because of compulsory schooling and compulsory relations to schools, even for out-of-school youth. This means that our studies might be longer in duration than a young person is a young person. As a scholar who works with youth aged 14 to 21, I've always taken the approach of trying to make youth participatory action research projects into spaces of curiosity and learning that are decidedly different than school. This means that they are centered in consent and actively avoid dynamics of compulsion and force. So projects need to be easy to join and easy to leave. We aren't asking for young people to sign long-term contracts, and we make participation or not morally neutral. No one is shamed for dipping out or for not participating all the way through a wave or project. No one is punished for having missed sessions, and they are welcomed to return. Youth are paid for the sessions that they attend in part or in full, and we feed them. This stance anticipates that Black and Indigenous and migrant youth who are part of our research collectives have other responsibilities to family and community and experience crises, grief and family changes, and also participate in ceremony, rest, and sometimes incarceration. So I'm going to shift away from the research that I've done in order to define research with youth and communities to some examples. This slide shows forms of data generated by these studies, which include transcriptions and photographs and other images, concept maps, spatial maps, short answer survey data, and cross-sectional survey data. Our approaches to data analysis are informed by what Steiner Cavale has called meaning structuring. Data analysis in this framework attends to meaning making, connections and overlaps and gaps, not in order to arrive at a coherent official truth, but to demonstrate the complexity and variation of the interpretation of participants. All of the work that I have described here is made possible through collaborations with the research assistants who are part of the Toronto Circle Lab. Making Sense of Movements was a youth participatory action research project created by the Toronto Circle Lab at the University of Toronto between January 2018 and December 2020. My idea for the project came from reading memoirs and biographies of writers and social movement organizers, including Audre Lorde, John Lewis, Miles Horton, and Bob Moses. From these, I learned how influential social movements are to young people, even those too young to participate in direct action themselves. We designed the first of 4 waves of Making Sense of Movements to study how prominent contemporary Black and Indigenous-led social movements were shaping young people's post-secondary planning. We wanted to know about how young people are making sense of social movement aims, what they mean for their relationships to schooling, to one another, and to the city of Toronto as a place. In one research activity, young youth talked to us about the difference it would make for them in an imagined 20 years from now, when the Black and Indigenous social movements that we were studying had been fully realized. In Jasmine's future self-portrait, she is wearing a gray sweater on one side of the image, and on the other, she has a star quilt draped over her shoulders and is holding an equal feather. This isn't a before and after, she explained to us. Both of these images are simultaneously true in the future in which Black and Indigenous social and environmental movements are successful. In the second wave, in April 2019 to July 2019, youth co-researchers continued to study the relationship between social movements and their futures this time by working in small groups to create podcast episodes. In this wave, young people had the decision-making about the social movements that we studied. They chose to study organizing happening under the name No Ban on Stolen Land, School Pushout, and to study the Dish with One Spoon Agreement, a wampum that informs relations in lands and waters called Toronto. These areas of inquiry were a grouping of unlike units, an organizing campaign, a social issue, an 18th century wampum with far earlier roots. These are sometimes what happens when young people are making decisions about where to take the directions of a study. In this wave, youth were especially attentive to the ways that bigger imaginaries of Canada as less racist, as more tolerant and more supportive of Black and Indigenous rights, especially when compared to the United States, prevented youth critiques of social injustice in Canada from being heard or taken seriously. In the third wave, youth co-researchers designed a study to research the racism and anti-Blackness of their schools. They mapped where racist incidences were happening in their schools, finding that these exchanges often happened in the hallways, just on the edge of where teacher supervision ended. More, they found that racism connected to Indigenous erasure and mocking of Indigenous life, alongside anti-Black racism, were always allowed to slip above and below school staff attention. The following is an excerpt from a new article that will be soon published in the Journal of Visual Culture. This article was written by Jade Nixon and Safani Hebtom, and I am the third author on this article. In research design meetings with youth co-researchers in their interviews with other young people, an important theme emerged: the sheer frequency of racist events in their schools and the inadequacy of school staff responses. The research highlighted not only that Black and Indigenous youth in Toronto's schools were experiencing racism, but that they were experiencing it often. Youth co-researchers and study participants observed that their schools treated some of these experiences of racism as a big deal and others as mundane or to be expected. Said another way, Black and Indigenous youth saw their schools treat some forms of racism as severe and other forms as acceptable. From their vantage points as students, racism at school is incessant, yet only some racist acts were acknowledged or recognized as such by schools. The majority of racism that students observe in their schools are tacitly or sometimes explicitly acceptable by school personnel. When some incidents are perceived by school personnel as requiring address, students who are tasked to help resolve the situation find themselves in the position of having to skew their own observations to attend to the incident as isolated, as extreme or rare, and as discrete in time or place. How schools respond or fail to respond reveal two of their major assumptions. One, that racist events are one-off incidents, and two, that racism in schools is repairable. To assume that racism in schools is incidental and repairable dismisses Black and Indigenous theories of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism that teach us otherwise. To say that racism is incidental is to define anti-Blackness and racism against Indigenous peoples as events rather than structures that continue to inform every aspect of settler society. Settler colonialism and transatlantic slavery are not histories fixed to the past, but legacies that underlie and shape ongoing hierarchies, forms of domination and oppression. In other words, there is nothing incidental about the racism that Black and Indigenous students face in their schools. It is symptomatic of embedded racial hierarchies that constitute our society. Addressing racism as incidental gives way to superficial verbal and textual responses, such as statements of dismay or shock, like, "I can't believe something like this would happen in our schools." and calls for school unity in letters home to parents and school assemblies. It treats racism, as learning from Catherine McKittrick's work, as astonishing in ways that are disingenuous to Black and Indigenous students. This assumption often gives way to harmful neglect within schools. Schools in Toronto are not alone in attempting to distance themselves from responsibility for racism and racist violence. Racism extends beyond schools. It can be seen in the way that liberal reparation and reconciliation projects package interpersonal responses as complete resolutions. The assumption of repairability lends itself to the idea and creation of task forces, committees, and to the production of extensive documentation destined to overburden the Black and Indigenous people charged with providing the labor required to address these systemic and deeply embedded issues. As a result, students are left unsatisfied by their school's response. In our work with the youth co-researchers, we turn to the concept of rupture rather than injury as a useful concept for shining light on the connection between failed responses to racism in schools and histories of transatlantic slavery, genocide, and settler colonialism. Treating racism in schools as rupture rather than an injury leads us to a set of refusals. One, a refusal to understand racism as incidental. Two, a refusal to believe that school-mandated responses are sufficient forms of redress. And three, a refusal to believe that repairability is possible. The writer who has influenced our thinking in this direction the most is Saidiya Hartman, specifically Hartman's 1997 field-shaping texts, Scenes of Subjection. Writing about redressive actions towards formerly enslaved people, Hartman asks, if redress does not or cannot restore or remedy loss, redeem the unceremoniously buried, or bridge the transatlantic divide, then what possibilities for relief, restitution, or recovery does it provide? This is a rhetorical question Hartman offers to trouble the underpinnings and utility of redress. Hartman's intervening on the possibility for restoration or remedy is instructive for our work. Youth co-researchers created an interview protocol for other Black and Indigenous youth that asked youth, what can be done when racism is everywhere? And I would have never thought to do this on my own, but they asked their peers, what should be done when a racist incident inevitably happens at school? In doing this, they were generating findings so that when the inevitable racist incident happens at school, schools don't have to rely on the harmed person to solve the problem of how to address it. This is the kind of insight that's made possible in doing participatory research with youth. The focus on rupture, not injury, shapes the questions in two significant ways. First, those harmed know best how a situation should be addressed. And two, addressing an issue is not the same as resolving an issue. During their interviews, youth co-researchers and youth participants expressed the embeddedness of racism in their schools. Given the normalcy and regularity of racism in their schools, the emphasis was not on fixing the issues. Therefore, the question of how racist situations should be addressed was not caught up in the trappings of finding a solution or resolution. Instead, these questions allowed for the time and space for youth to speculate what could be done in the very likely hypothetical that their school would be the next site of a racist incident. This approach is one that learns from a core understanding within transformative justice practices, in which plans and processes for attending to a relational breach are considered even before the breach has happened. This approach also seeks to learn from people in relation to those who have harmed, not only the harmed person, to determine what steps of redress might entail. In response to the question around how racist incidents should be addressed, youth participants' responses varied from desiring better resources for Black and Indigenous students, direct acknowledgement, or some form of consequence. They should put more funding into the BSA, the Black Student Association, programs where kids should feel more comfortable going to and having fun going to. Just support, show that support, make more clubs, have classes on Indigenous history and Black history. Another young person said, I think for one, teachers and staff should just listen to the kids involved. And I think also just holding people accountable and trying to make sure that the kid is okay as well. I think that would help a lot, like just doing something towards the benefit of the kid being hurt and not the kid doing the hurting would be a nice switch. In this dyad of responses, along with other responses to these questions, youth participants gesture towards more viable and visible responses to the racist incidences at their schools. Youth participants' responses insist that the onus of addressing racist incidents rests on school staff and not on Black and Indigenous students. Although Black and Indigenous students are the ones who know best where and how racism is experienced in their schools, they should not be burdened with the expectation to address these situations, especially when the misconception is that these situations are easily resolvable. As Kromerink suggests, the responses to racist incidences in schools should center and prioritize the well-being of the young person that was harmed. Here, the expectation of redress is not placed on the young people who are experiencing harm firsthand. Further, participants such as Cassius suggested that schools should respond by increasing investments in spaces that do or have the potential to provide meaning and comfort for students. This strategy has many possible applications, such as schools responding to racist incidents by increasing material support to student organizations and spaces and activities in which Black and Indigenous students are already organizing and thriving. This might, at first glance, seem like throwing money at a problem or trying to purchase forgiveness. But instead, we might understand one of the impacts of incidences of racism as communicating to students that they do not belong in a particular school setting. When racism towards Black and Indigenous students is happening almost everywhere in youth co-researchers' schools, student organizations such as the BSA can offer students alternative sites of belonging and community. Thus, by investing in spaces that Black and Indigenous youth are already making for themselves, school and school districts might offset this particular impact. This is very different from a school setting up a task force or a listening circle. In policy research, research users are those in the position to make findings actionable. Ruth Lopez Turley has argued that social scientists can simply create research and hope that someone will come along and find it and put it to use. Instead, Lopez Turley has found that policy and practice research get used under the following conditions. Research users know and trust researchers and have helped to develop the questions. There is frequent communication between researchers and research users, and results are customized and timely. In my work with community organizations and with youth research collectives, we try to meet all of these conditions. Community organizations and youth co-researchers are both my collaborators and the research users. The theories of change we engage are deeply connected to their motivations for engaging in research, often which are connected to their futurities, self-determination, livability, and connections to lands and waters. What I know now that I didn't know at the beginning of my career is the need to prioritize community research users' timelines for access to our data and findings, rather than waiting for academic publication processes to be complete. This is not to say that academic publication is not important. It surely is. And I continue to publish our work. But I also try to make sure that we are working with study findings in real time to codify them and turn them into materials that can be engaged by communities in their decision-making, planning, and organizing. Doing research with youth and communities is a methodology, more than just a set of methods. To do this work often means engaging with people who have family members who have been harmed by university practices, including investments in residential schooling, research misconduct, and universities' role in justifying land dispossession. Together, this means that the goal of describing methodology is not to create adherence to that methodology, but a set of pedagogical and situated conversations about consent, extraction, and the purposes of research. Thank you so much for your engagement today, and I hope that you're able to use the Q&A function in order to share some questions. But before we move into Q&A, I wonder now, where are you on the Sloth Scale? And so you can take a moment to reflect on that, text a friend. And I'll turn things back over to our hosts.
Thank you, Eve, for this wonderful talk. I must say that on the Sloth Scale, I went from a 4 to a number 1. So thank you so much for your talk. And I am joined now by Lindsay Brandt, who is an educational developer here at the Center for Teaching and Learning, to go through the Q&A session. So please feel free to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And then Lindsay will share some of the guidelines that we're hoping folks will engage with through the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Yasmin. So just as we begin to enter into the Q&A portion, we thought it was important to highlight some Q&A guidelines that were actually provided by Dr. Eve Tuck herself on her Twitter feed, and we thought they were worth repeating here today. So make sure it's really a question when you're posing a question, and make sure you aren't actually trying to say, is that you should have been given the paper. So figure out if the question needs to be posed and answered in front of everyone, or if it's something you should save until later. And then Eve has done a lot of work for us today. So figure out if your question is asking her to do more work, or if it's something that you could do on your own as a in solidarity, or as an ally, or as a researcher yourself. And so those are just some guidelines to guide us today, and we're happy to take questions in the Q&A box now.